accumulate, but once they become harmful, the organism dies. And that's not going to happen all at the same time for all the organisms, right? There's no way it would happen all at once. So this is going to fluctuate and reach an equilibrium, would it not?
Well, remember I used the term average, so we're not talking about the individuals, we're talking about the population. The
Right.
decline we're talking about is a decline in average fitness over time. We're not just talking about individuals having lower fitness. We're saying the whole population is declining in fitness. And I just mentioned that nobody's actually shown any mechanism for this equilibrium. So yeah, you can just say the word equilibrium if you want, but that's not helpful, right? That's not evidence for anything.
Well, I didn't find the analogies very convincing, but I guess I'll hand it over to Zach also.
Sure.
Now.
Okay, Jackson Rowe, excellent back and forth discussion. I appreciate your points. And so, Jackson, what I'm going to do is put you backstage. Zach Hancock will be up, and Andrew Cumming will be on deck. And we've still got a packed house backstage, so we'll keep rocking the open mic this way. And so, okay, firstly, Zach, great to have you on. If I'm not mistaken, you were on several months ago for one of our open mics with Professor David McQueen, but this is our first face-to-face meeting, and so it is a privilege to have you here. Why don't you, for anybody unfamiliar with you in the audience, a little bit about yourself, how you doing tonight, and then pick a point for you and Paul to engage.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Zach Hancock. I'm an evolutionary biologist at the University of Michigan. I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and my work is in spatial population genetics. So this is my favorite topic in creationism because it's like the most relevant to like what I actually do. And I've had conversations with both Paul and Donny. So I've been like looking forward to like actually having a live discussion with you about this. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. So I kind of want to start off with just a couple of clarifying points from your presentation, Paul, and then maybe hop into a particular line of questioning. So one of the things that you talk about is absolute fitness. And I just want to clarify that absolute fitness is actually a population genetic term, and it refers to the non-relative version of fitness, right? So if you take the absolute or the highest fitness individual in the population, and then you divide that value by all of the offspring that other individuals have that are less than that value, then you're relativizing it to one, right? But absolute fitness, you just don't relativize it. And that way, the total number of offspring that you have is your absolute fitness. And this is actually really, really useful because it allows us to connect genotypic fitness to population growth rates. And in fact, there's a longstanding ecological principle that approximately the natural log of mean genotypic fitness is equal to the population growth rate. So we can actually derive fitness values from populations straight from the rate at which populations grow if we don't relativize fitness. So I want to make that clear because it's an important component in evolutionary theory that is like relevant to this conversation.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you're agreeing with what I presented there. You're agreeing that fitness is not purely relative and that we can parameterize fitness with some actual objective measurable function. So the function that you're choosing to use here is, of course, reproduction. And that is, if you want to look at it that way, I would argue that is only one of many of life's functions, correct? There are many things that we do besides reproducing, like, for example, having debates. So, yeah, what you said is correct. But the only thing I will say in response to that is that when evolutionists try to act like the only relevant function in life is reproduction, I would say that is a massive oversimplification. And
do you
especially
I'm sorry, but do you think that we actually think that way? That the only so because we're talking about me, right? So do you think that I go around thinking the only relevant function is life and is reproduction? Like, obviously, that's not true, right?
No, but is there any other function besides reproduction that you are aware of that has ever been tied to absolute fitness?
No, because again, absolute fitness is an evolutionary measure. We're interested in the spread of alleles through populations. And so we need a way to measure the rate at which we expect them to spread. And that's what fitness is.
Yeah, I understand. But I'm just suggesting, and I'm not the only one, Dr. Sanford has suggested that, we could parameterize absolute fitness with more than just simply reproduction.
You'd fail to make any predictions if you did that. You would completely fail to predict allele frequency changes. You would fail to predict phenotypic changes through time because none of those other things contribute to that. So you'd just be muddying your model with no additional information.
Well, I don't agree based on the fact that if you just think about, let's think about, for example, breathing, right? So you could, and this is something that would be, I'm not suggesting this would be easy to do by any means. But I am suggesting that if you think about all of the many, many functions that are built into a complex life form like a human being, reproduction is, so for example, like I said, breathing, okay? When we breathe, we get a certain amount of usable oxygen out of the air. So imagine for a moment that deleterious mutations did something to slightly decrease the efficiency with which we could pull what we need out of the air. Just like when you go up really, really high and there's not enough oxygen in the atmosphere, that has an effect on you. Well, imagine a deleterious mutation that slightly decreased our ability to respirate, but not enough that it prevents us from actually living. I'm talking about very, very slight.
But that's still your absolute fitness. It's still affecting your reproductive fitness.
Well, no, because this slight decrease in breathing is not going to affect your ability to reproduce in any way, shape, or form. Okay, because it's so slight.
Well, but a very slightly deleterious mutation still affects your ability to reproduce. It's just the effect of it is very, very small. That's what we mean when we say an effectively neutral, though strictly speaking, deleterious allele, is there isn't a measurable effect on fitness. It's just so small that the rate of genetic drift overcomes it, right? Like the variance in allele frequencies overcomes the selective coefficient. That's what effective neutrality means.
I get that's the theory, but it seems intuitively obvious to me that if you tweaked my body's, like I have asthma, so I'm essentially one of these people that has a deleterious mutation that affects my breathing. I have asthma. So, but it's not affecting my ability to reproduce. And so what I'm trying to get across to you is that, yes, there are deleterious mutations that are degrading a function of life, but are not in any way impairing your reproductive ability. That's just intuitively obvious that that's the case.
But again, your argument is that that the accumulation of each of these effectively neutral, though strictly speaking, deleterious alleles will degrade. So that means that they must indeed, each individual one, have some measurable effect on fitness, even if very small.
No, it won't be measurable at all because, again, it's not affecting my ability to reproduce. So there's no measurable effect. It's not just that it's a very small.
Can you tell me what effective neutrality means? What is that? What you use that in your presentation. Can you tell me what that actually means?
So effective neutrality is it means that it does negatively impact. Again, it's going to have to be absolute fitness here. But the
way I defined that, like the actual way absolute fitness is defined.
Yeah, well, I think there is an inherent problem there that I'm trying to. That's what I'm trying to say. I think there's an inherent tension that I'm bringing out right now in these writings because, on the one hand, yes, they acknowledge there is a decline, and they acknowledge that all mutations must have some effect. But on the other hand, it's really obvious that not all mutations have any effect whatsoever on reproduction.
Well, if there's no effect whatsoever, then the distribution of fitness effects is zero, right? If the fitness effect has no effect whatsoever, that is a strictly neutral mutation.
With respect to reproduction, yeah. So I'm saying that is a tension that we're seeing here in the writings that I've chosen.
But
to
none
highlight.
of this has to do with effective neutrality. That's my whole point. Is we're still not actually pinned down what that means.
Is absolute fitness, Paul? Is absolute fitness equivalent to total functionality?
Yeah, total functionality.
And so total functionality is down. Although
let's take a very simple example. Let's say you have an organism with 100 functions, and 99 of those functions represent your absolute fitness that don't contribute anything to the next generation. If only one of them does, then the next generation doesn't matter. 99% of those functions are completely lost. The only thing that matters is what is contributing to whether that organism is going to pass those traits on. If they don't pass those traits on, or they don't contribute to those traits being passed on, we don't care if they change over time.
Well,
right?
we do care.
It's only about whether or not, evolutionarily is what I'm talking about here. Evolutionarily, and for like fitness in a genetic entropy sense, like, are we going to go extinct? That's about whether or not the population is going to collapse due to the accumulation of mutations, which means that it's going to decrease reproductive output. That is what that means.
Yeah, you're correct in the end. You're jumping to the end point here, but I'm talking about where we're like at this point. Like I have a deleterious mutation, and my ability to breathe is just slightly less than optimal.
So
but it's not affecting.
Does it have an effect on your ability to reproduce?
Zero effect on my ability to
reproduce.
It's
strictly neutral mutation. So when you look at Kimura's curve, it sits at exactly strictly neutral, and it will not degrade population.
Kimura, in his own words, says that his model has 0 strictly neutral mutations.
I'm telling you, what you just defined is a strictly neutral mutation. It's one that has no fitness effect.
And I'm telling you, I agree, but at the same time, it's not. And there's a reason why everybody in this population genetics field is saying, look, there are no strictly neutral mutations, but they're missing one mark here. And the mark that they're missing is the life functions of an organism are all important to reproduction, but
then they're all contributing to fitness. Well,
I'm trying to explain this to you.
Okay.
I have a slightly decreased ability to respirate, but my reproduction is not affected, but that means that this damage that I possess in my genome is going to be passed along.
But if it doesn't damage you and it doesn't damage your offspring, then it's strictly neutral and it will not damage the population.
You're saying that there's no difference between someone who has asthma and someone who has perfectly optimal breathing.
I'm saying what you said. That's what you just said. You said that your fitness is not impacted. You are still having offspring just as well as somebody with asthma.
But this is
but his offspring. I just want to point this out, Zach. His offspring, his progeny, are going to have more deleterious mutations than he did, and his grandparents did.
Yeah, this is what I'm getting to.
I just want to say this. So the whole point. So the point of genetic entropy, as Paul is describing, is that every generation is more degenerate or more mutant than the previous generation.
But that means that it must actually be a deleterious allele. That's my whole point, is that if he's defining it as strictly neutral, then it doesn't matter how many of them they're not accumulating. Doesn't matter. The fitness effect is 0.
So if my offspring breathe slightly worse than me, is that good or bad? Is that a deleterious or strictly neutral mutation?
Well, we're bringing in some values in the good and bad. What we're interested in is, does it affect your ability to reproduce? Now, I'm fine with like saying that it does and considering it as like a effectively neutral mutation. That's fine with me. But let's nail down what that term actually means, because I feel like we're confused on what effective neutrality is.
Well,
because if it's strictly neutral in like the way you're defining fitness, it doesn't matter in an evolutionary sense. Populations will persist forever. It needs to be effectively neutral in the way I'm talking about fitness for it to actually impact population like function and growth rates.
Well, it's the aggregate that where it does impact. So yeah, in the short term, in this one generation, the damage to my respiration is strictly neutral with respect only to reproduction, but it doesn't change the fact that damage has occurred. And when you pass that damage on to the next generation, and then you add more damage onto it, eventually you will reach a point where it will affect reproduction. You know, if I had, you know, instead of a 1%, you know, reduction in breathing, if my breathing was reduced, if we just keep iterating, if my breathing got reduced by 75%, then yeah, you better believe that's going to affect reproduction. So you can't just say that in one generation, if something doesn't affect reproduction, then it doesn't matter. You can just throw that away.
I'm just repeating what you said. You said that it doesn't affect your fitness. So if you pass it on, it doesn't affect your offspring's fitness.
Zach, let me try to clear up, and maybe I'll try to introduce a different analogy, because it seems like you're kind of talking past each other. So imagine that each generation inherits dad's backpack full of rocks, but they're going to add one more rock. In the sense that you're talking about, in a reproductive sense, that backpack that's getting heavier each generation isn't going to prevent that organism or that individual from reproducing.
But this is good, Sam, because this is a measurable thing.
Hold on, Zach. Let me get my thought out. Eventually, there's going to be so many rocks in that backpack that it will affect reproduction. So what Paul is doing is drawing a distinction between what you're calling nearly neutral and something that's neutral in an absolute sense. Something can be neutral in a reproductive sense, but not necessarily neutral in an absolute sense, because in an absolute sense, these mutations are accumulating like rocks in a backpack.
But again, if there's rocks in a backpack, they're measurable. So they're having some effect, even if that effect is vanishingly small. That's an effectively neutral mutation. That's what we mean. But if we say that it has no effect, then it is strictly neutral and it doesn't matter, right? So we need to distinguish those two things. And again, we still haven't talked about what we mean by effectively neutral. I would still really like that defined.
Okay, so Zach, effectively neutral, it's defined in the literature. And I agree with the definition in the literature, only with this one caveat, that they are oversimplifying the concept of fitness by suggesting that we should only parameterize fitness by one metric only, which is reproduction. And the reason why that's misguided is that there are many body functions that we all possess which can be degraded in very tiny amounts without affecting reproduction. But we can't call that strictly neutral, because to say that it's strictly neutral would imply that it didn't actually damage anything, which would be incorrect. So
you still not told me what effectively neutral means.
It means that it is not affecting. It is not a selectable difference. That's what it means. It's not selectable. It's invisible to natural selection.
But it does still have a fitness effect. It does still have some effect on fitness, even if very, very small.
Well, I think that's what you're talking about there is the tension here. It's the tension where these experts want to be able to say that there are no strictly neutral, because it's intuitively obvious that any undesigned haphazard change to a highly functional machine, which they've confirmed that's what life is, a highly functional, highly complex machine. It's intuitively obvious that you're not going to be able to randomly and haphazardly just go in and make changes to the design or the code, if you will, of that machine, and have it just absolutely do nothing at all. So that's why they're saying, look, it's going to do something, even if it's vanishingly small. But the tension,
they're defining it based on reproductive fitness.
I know the tension is coming out because they're only defining it in terms of reproductive fitness. And what I've just shown you here is that it's very, very clear that there are ways that you can damage something without damaging in the short term its ability to survive and reproduce.
But what is this benefiting your argument? If the argument, like you cite all of these population geneticists that they agree that effectively neutral mutations exist, they're defining it under the distribution of fitness effects, which means that it's affecting some component of reproduction. Why are you adding in this additional thing? Why don't we just talk about what they actually mean? And so I feel like we're muddying the water here by changing definitions of things and suggesting that effectively neutral means something that's different than what effectively neutral means to all the people that wrote about it. But we're going to cite all the people that wrote about it and just like misconstrue what they mean. I'm very confused why we're adding in these extra definitions.
In Paul's example about a reduction in breathing every single generation, how can that be considered strictly neutral if there is a level of reduction at play?
We're losing function.
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with it being an effectively neutral, though strictly speaking, deleterious allele. He's the one that said it's strictly neutral.
Okay,
So-
Zach, we're not going to get anywhere just continuing to argue about whether we're going to parameterize fitness by reproduction or
But
something
your
else.
entire argument rests on this point, and this is why I'm trying to make it, is if the entire argument of genetic entropy rests on effective neutrality, it rests on the accumulation of effectively neutral, though strictly speaking, deleterious alleles, we need to know what that means. We need to know what is that box size that he shows. We need to be able to say how big is that box. Right? Those things really, really matter for this discussion. And if we can't even agree on what effectively neutral is, then we can't agree what that box size is. That's why this is important to nail down.
Well, Dr. Sanford has never attempted to define the exact size of that box, because to do that would require a level of genetic understanding that no expert possesses.
No,
It's far too complex.
No, it doesn't. That's
So-
not, again, this is because we don't understand what effective neutrality means. You don't need any other understanding to draw where the bounds of the box are. Now, you
Zach,
may struggle to
see if
measure
I
each
can
one of the fitness of, hold on, you may struggle to measure each one of the fitness effects, especially that are very small, but knowing where the bounds of that box is, that's quite simple. We do that all the time.
Okay, can I ask you to explain this for me? Like, maybe this can get us past this barrier to something more productive. Which one of the average absolute fitness over time conceptual diagrams that I put up on the screen, which one would you agree with? Or none of them? And why?
You're talking about the zigzaggy ones?
Yeah. Average AFOT curve. Which AFOT curve are you gonna
It totally depends. Totally depends. It depends on the effective size of the population. It depends on things like environmental stochasticity. Many things are going to shape population fitness through time, including things like the selective landscape. There are lots of things. So I wouldn't draw just one simple thing. But if we're tired of arguing about this, I do have some things that I would like to move on to, and I don't want to take up all the time.
Well, no, I want to make sure we talk about what's actually on topic.
Okay.
So this is the important issue. You're suggesting you believe in evolution, and so you are suggesting that average absolute fitness over time can go up and up and up, rather than what Dr. Sanford says, it's going down and down and down.
I have not said that.
But here's the problem. This is why we also have an issue here, because if we're only going to parameterize fitness in terms of just sheer reproduction alone, if that's your parameter of fitness, then the problem is, well, guess what? That would mean that human beings are less fit than bacteria, because bacteria reproduce way more than we do. Okay? So that's not what we're trying to explain. We're not trying to explain how many kids can we have, okay? We're trying to explain how you get from a single-celled organism to a human being in genetic terms. How do you get that extreme increase of function or absolute fitness? But again, it cannot be parameterized only as reproduction, because then you're going to turn it on its head and you're going to say single-celled organisms are more fit than multicellular organisms because they reproduce more in an absolute sense. So how are you going to explain to me how you get from a single-celled organism to a multicellular complex organism genetically? That's what I'm asking.
Let's take a second. And again, we're so confused on what fitness is. If a population is stable in size, let's say you go out in nature and you measure a population and it's stable at around 1,500 individuals. What's the fitness of that population over time?
Well, can you describe whether you mean relative or absolute fitness?
Absolute fitness.
Okay.
And the way that it's actually understood in population genetics.
You just said that it's stable over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean
population size is stable over time.
So, okay.
Reproductively stable?
Reproductively stable. So that would mean that would mean it would be flatline in terms of absolute fitness, right?
That means that the absolute fitness is 1. right? Because each individual is on average replacing themselves. And that's what we see very often in populations in nature, that on average, populations have a fitness of 1. They're just keeping the population size stable, right? And so very generally what we see is that populations are sitting on these adaptive peaks, right? When you enter in a new environment, the fitness goes down for everyone, and then they explore a new adaptive peak, they reach the top of that peak, and then they stabilize there. And when you stabilize on the top of an adaptive peak, any additional mutations are dragging you off of the peak. So when you're sitting on a peak, most mutations are deleterious. To maintain like just population stability at an adaptive peak, most mutations must be deleterious. And so like that's the entire point I'm trying to get to, is that evolutionary theory absolutely predicts this deleterious mutation rate. It absolutely predicts that it should be this case. And not only does it predict that it should be this case, we can show, if we can agree on what effective neutrality is, that you can substitute every single base pair in the human genome to an effectively neutral, though slightly deleterious mutation and still persist. So if we can nail these things down, I can demonstrate both of these principles mathematically.
Do you agree with the statement that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious?
I just said that, and I just explained.
Well, no, because you actually said that if you're at an adaptive peak, then they're mostly deleterious.
Mm-hmm.
So you added a condition there that the literature I quoted did not add. And actually, you gave a different reason for it than the literature gave as well. So
what did
that's
the
why
literature give?
The reason the literature gave was that it is much easier to break a complex functional machine than to improve upon it.
Well, if you're at an adaptive peak, any change breaks it.
It's not. It has nothing to do whether you're at an adaptive peak or not. It has to do with a fundamental design or engineering principle that any machine is more likely to be damaged by unplanned or undesigned changes to the machine than it is to be improved by those changes. That's the explanation, and that's the reason for it. So even if you're not at an adaptive peak, it is still the case that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious.
Again, they must be to maintain a stable population. If they weren't, if let's say there was an equal distribution of beneficial and deleterious alleles, populations would explode in size. We would be neck deep in elephants right now. They have to be this way, or the population would literally explode. Like, again, I can show this mathematically, or I can just try to explain it verbally.
Zach, you still haven't given even a single response to anything in the actual argument. All you've done is
you have yet to define effective neutrality. Don't come at me with this.
Yeah, well, okay, this is the problem. I mean, you want to argue about definition so that you can distract away from the fact that you actually have no credible answer to this problem. Kimura said there was a degradation over time, okay? Now, let's set aside the issue of how we parameterize absolute fitness. Let's take for granted for a moment that we're just talking about reproduction, okay? Even so, Kimura said there was a very gradual decline over time, right? We on the same page so far?
And why did he say that, Paul? Why did Kimura say that?
He said it because the vast majority of mutations are too small in their effects to be weeded out by natural selection.
Is that the reason, or is it because he only modeled a distribution of fitness effects that included negative?
Well, he only modeled negative because you essentially can't even measure. Beneficial mutations are so rare as to be essentially unmeasurable.
So we have no distribution of fitness effects that have positive values in it.
The ones I've looked at have never included anything on their graph for positive.
Hold on, Zach. So just to clear up the confusion,
Kimura certainly didn't.
We could grant, for the sake of this discussion, that there are positive mutations, but that would be a separate topic. We're talking about the accumulation of harmful mutations that cannot be weeded out by natural selection.
Well, I mean, again, as I said, I'm fine to do the math with that and show you why that's wrong. But we would need to nail down what effective neutrality means, and it doesn't seem.
Then you wouldn't be dealing with Paul. You wouldn't be dealing with the argument that Paul is presenting at that point. You would be.
Paul is inventing terms that don't exist in population genetics. So I can't.
Hold on.
I can't address
Hold on.
his argument if he's just making up terms.
Well, it's hard to argue one way or another with over talking. So, but what I'm saying is you would be deviating from the argument that Paul has presented tonight, and that there is an accumulation, a gradual accumulation of mutations that are not removed by natural selection. And it didn't seem like you disagreed with that. It seemed like that you agreed with the population geneticist that Paul has cited, but put a caveat on there about being at some sort of peak.
No, but Paul doesn't agree with them. That's my whole point. I can't make their argument because Paul doesn't agree with them, because he's redefining
Zach,
fitness.
what is the explanation that you would like to give for how we overcome the decline that Kimura has identified?
But Kimura didn't identify a decline. That's my whole point, is that's not what that paper says. In that paper, he is modeling a very specific model that includes effectively neutral mutations under selective constraint. That's literally the title of the paper. It's a mathematical model. The whole point of it is he wanted to see a couple of things. He wanted to see, what does heterozygosity look like in effectively neutral situations, and what should the rate of molecular evolution be in effectively neutral situations. That's all that he did. Now, he needed a distribution of fitness effects to test his model against, so he created one out of his head. It's just a theoretical construct, because it doesn't matter. He just needed a distribution. And in 79, we didn't have very many good distribution of fitness effects. So he tested his model against it. Now, at the very end of it, he includes beneficial mutations. There's a whole section on slightly advantageous beneficial mutations, not mega beneficial, slightly advantageous ones. And he showed that when you include slightly advantageous mutations in a constant environment, populations explode in size. They explode in size because if you're sitting on an adaptive peak, and you get a constant supply of beneficial mutations, your fitness is just going to increase forever and will be neck deep in elephants. That doesn't happen because, again, beneficial mutations only matter for evolution when you're shifting peaks.
Okay. So to go back to what you said, I just have to clarify. You're essentially trying to rewrite Kimura's paper and have it say something different than what he actually
I'm saying
said.
exactly what Kimura wrote.
All right, I'm
Kimura's
speaking
paper.
now.
Hold on, Zach. Let's let
we need
Paul
to give
get
me a
his
chance
thought
to
out.
speak uninterrupted.
Yeah.
So I'll just have to go back and reread what Kimura wrote. Note that even if the frequency of strictly neutral mutations is 0 in the present model, that means every mutation has an effect, just like Dr. Walker said. A large fraction of mutations can be effectively neutral. And here's where this is what he says that refutes what you said. Whether such a small rate of deterioration in fitness constitutes a threat to the survival and welfare of the species, not the individual, is a moot point. Now, it was really, I think, asinine and ridiculous that he would call that a moot point, because he just has agreed and he has just confirmed that according to his model, so it's dishonest when you claim that he was only modeling deleterious mutations. That's not the case.
It is the case.
Well, hold on. It is not the case because he just agreed that according to his model, there is a deterioration in effect. So you're
In his
denying
model, under his distribution.
Don't break in. Okay. What we need to do is mute the mic for a moment so I can speak uninterrupted.
You rambling
Zach,
on.
let's do this. I'll jump in real quick. If there's points that you disagree with that Paul is saying in his uninterrupted response, write them down. Once we throw it back to you, we'll give you more than enough time to address them, and vice versa as well. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah. So Dr. Kimura is definitely telling us that according to his model, and actually Tomoko Ota's model, there is a deterioration over time in fitness. So what Zach is saying here tonight is that no, there is no deterioration. It's just a theoretical mind experiment that Kimura did. But what he didn't mean, he certainly didn't mean what he said when he said that his model shows a gradual deterioration of fitness. So I would say that's dishonest. Now, it's true that this paper is from 1979, but it's also true that modern day population geneticists like Dr. Walker fully support and endorse this model and still use it in their own research. It's not correct to say that Kimura was deliberately ignoring beneficial mutations in his model. What is correct is that he didn't bother to try to include them in his model, but then at the very end of his paper, he invokes them as a rescuing device, despite the fact that he didn't model them. So, that's intellectually dishonest in itself, because you've got a model where you're willing to put a number on it for the deleterious, but then you're going to just leave the beneficials off, but then invoke them to overcome the problems that your model just demonstrated. And that's what he does at the end of the paper. He tries to dismiss the issue as a moot point, which it isn't. And then he says it will easily be taken care of by adaptive gene substitutions that must occur from time to time. So that's speculative, but here's where it gets to mega beneficial. Zach wants to say that he didn't mean mega beneficial. He only meant slightly beneficial. But that actually cannot work, because we have to have something that is going to effectively counterbalance the overwhelmingly asymmetrical nature of the distribution of fitness effects. So if the beneficial mutation is only very slightly beneficial, then guess what? We got a problem. We got a problem that the vast majority of mutations that are happening each and every generation are deleterious. So if a very rare, infrequent, beneficial mutation is going to somehow counterbalance the weight of deleterious accumulation, then yeah, it is going to have to be mega beneficial. So that's why we're calling it gene substitutions, instead of maybe a single point mutation or whatever. The point is, he's definitely having to invoke a mega beneficial here to overcome the weight of the genetic load. And that's just something that Zach is trying to obscure. And I would just have to say that everything he said he's spent more time trying to argue terminology and obscure words than he has to actually present any viable mechanism to overcome Kimura's decline.
Okay, thank you,
So
Paul.
I also got to say, we do have a lot of people here, so this isn't a Paul versus Zach debate night, but if we want to give Zach any final words, let's move on to the next one. But Zach, do you have anything else that actually addresses Kimura's decline?
Go ahead, Zach.
So at the end of the paper, just before the discussion, there's a section titled Slightly Advantageous Mutations, where he explicitly models advantageous mutations. It is literally in the paper. He doesn't just make up this last thing. You've read one line and then you quoted it, probably because you saw it in Sanford's book. But if you actually go to the paper, he models explicitly beneficial mutations. They are in there. The reason
they're not on his distribution.
I was quiet. I let you talk. It's now my turn to give my closing remarks. They are not in his distribution of fitness effects. Because, again, if you had read the paper, you would know why. He doesn't include them because if you have a constant supply of beneficial mutations, even infinitesimally slightly ones, they fix at a rate so much higher than beneficial ones or than deleterious ones, because deleterious mutations can only fix by genetic drift. Beneficial ones fix by selection. So even if they are very, very rare, they fix so quickly that it made his population explode in size, so he disregarded them. And because in real life, like, we don't live in a constant environment, the environment's constantly changing. This permits these beneficial mutations to not cause populations to explode in size. All of this is in the paper. It's in the section of the paper where he talks about this explicitly. Yeah, so, I mean, just to close out, because I have been taking up a lot of time and I want to let other people come in here and talk. Again, as I said before, the issue of having like a lot of deleterious mutations relative to the number of beneficial ones is exactly what we expect in evolutionary theory. If you had an equal amount of beneficial and deleterious, given that beneficial fix so fast, the population would explode in size. You have to have more deleterious mutations and then compensatory beneficial ones very rarely, and you will have fitness equilibrium. I'm happy to send you papers on this, Paul and Donny, and I'm be happy to sit down and do the math with you on this. But I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed it, and I will let Andrew and the next people have their say.
I want to ask Zach a question before he leaves. Does Kimura actually show the distribution of rare beneficial mutations to nearly neutral mutations accumulating, Zach? Does
No, he doesn't
the
show a distribution, but he gives it as gamma distributed, which is exactly how he does the Deleterious.
Okay, but Dr. John Sanford does show the distribution of beneficial mutations and nearly neutral mutations.
Well,
and he demonstrates that the vast majority of beneficial mutations will be unselectable. He also points out that when you do get a rare beneficial mutation, today we understand that a lot of the times they're reductive. And so that's why I think the key issue does come down to what we were talking about earlier. What is the best definition of fitness? Because if it's reproductive fitness, I find that to be far too narrow of a definition of fitness. We need a more broad definition of fitness, which I think is total functionality. And that's more real world, where we have different environments that organisms are entering and dealing with. Go ahead, Paul. I heard you saying something.
I mean, it's just unfortunate that Zach has done nothing but obfuscate, because, again, most of the mutations that are deleterious in Kimura's model are unselectable according to Kimura. So we can't say, well, yeah, we have to have these deleterious mutations to keep the population in check. When Zach says that, he's suggesting that these are selectable mutations. And that's exactly the opposite of what Kimura is talking about. He is talking about unselectable, which means they don't thin out the population. They don't kill individuals in the population. So this red herring that Zach is bringing in about keeping populations in check is completely irrelevant to this entire issue that we're talking about. We are talking about deleterious mutations that are unselectable and do not, affect the death. They don't thin out the population. They are free.
We don't know what they mean because we couldn't define effective neutrality. We don't know what that box means. We don't know what mutations fall under there because we can't decide what effective neutrality means.
Effectively neutral is just unselectable.
Means we can't actually model
it's
it.
Just unselectable, Zach.
This is just going to be.
It's more than that. That's why it's so important. It's more than just what's selectable. That's the whole point I've been trying to make, is that if we don't know what it means, we won't understand why this model is so incorrect. But
so
again, Zach, before we leave, I just want to jump in. I want to be fair before we move on to the next person. Give me your brief 30-second response to this. I'll even give you the last word, and then we'll bring in the next person. So where Dr. John Sanford does respond to this in pretty good detail. He says, Kimura does not show the beneficial distribution, which is essential to the question of net gain versus net loss. This is what I just pointed out. When I, Dr. Sanford, show the beneficial distribution, while Kimura did not do this, I suspect he would have drawn it much as I did. Anyone can see the problem. The vast majority of beneficial mutations will be unselectable. And then even if one is selectable, again, most of them, as rare as they are, turn out to be reductive on a genotypic level, like we see in Lenski's experiment. But I don't want to make too many points. So I don't see how what you're saying here, Zach, and I do appreciate it, or the solution, adaptive mutations or beneficial mutations, is going to counterbalance any damage or answer the bigger picture question. So feel free, Zach, 30 seconds if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, again, Kimura did model them. He didn't draw a picture, so there's not like a figure one picture, but he models them as gamma distributed with a mean lambda. It's in his section. So you don't need to put numbers into this. He just does it algebraically. And so you can see what the effect would be. And it turns out that the rate of molecular evolution becomes proportional to the population size, which means that the populations explode in size. So that's why he was like, okay, this is clearly unrealistic.
It's clearly unrealistic. And gamma distributed just tells us the shape. It doesn't tell us the relative size on the graph. So that's kind of a little bit more.
That's what the lambda parameter does. That's what I'm saying, though.
So are you suggesting that Kimura was saying that the beneficial mutations were exactly equal in in impact to the deleterious? Are you saying he put the same?
You don't have to put numbers. It's an algebraic expression. You can put whatever numbers in it you like. The problem is that the rate of molecular evolution becomes equal to the population size. When that happens, it doesn't matter what numbers you put in for gamma and lambda. The population will explode because they're proportional. That's a problem. So you can model it. That's why he said slightly advantageous. Doesn't matter how small that distribution is. But I'm gonna go now. I'm gonna let Dr. Duff talk.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
I've really enjoyed it, and yep. See everybody later.
Okay, Zach, thank you very much for joining. Dr. Hancock, we'll have to do this again at some point in the future. Always a fun topic to discuss.